No mai, haere mai, piki mai, kaki mai, kia ora iwi, and welcome to 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We do 30 minutes with one guest and no cuts, so what we record is what you get. Well, after 30 years leading Human Rights Watch, American attorney Kenneth Roth has been called the godfather of human rights. His father was a Jewish refugee who fled Nazi Germany, so Kenneth Roth knew all too well the horrors that governments are capable of. And he's spent a lifetime exposing human rights abuses all over the world. His book, Righting Wrongs, tracks his leadership of Human Rights Watch between 1993 and 2022, as it went from modest beginnings to a global powerhouse, tackling regimes such as those in Syria, Russia and China. But what of his own country, America? How are human rights faring under Donald Trump? And are we in a human rights recession? Let's start the clock. 30 minutes with Kenneth Roth. Kenneth Roth, welcome to 30.
Great to be with you, Guyon.
Thanks for joining us. Look, in your book, Righting Wrongs, you used a beautiful Martin Luther King quote that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Do you still believe that, or after 3 decades exposing human rights abuses, has that left you somewhat less optimistic about the human condition?
Well, Guyon, I quoted that. It's a famous quote. Everybody uses it. And I quoted it to point out that it's actually not true. And indeed, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself recognized later in that same speech that there's nothing guaranteed about the moral arc of the universe. It takes a fight. It takes a struggle to defend rights. And that's what I believe is necessary. I think that governments, by their nature, are tempted to violate human rights. It's a way to suppress the opposition. It's a way to stay in power. And the role of the human rights movement is to fight back and to basically change the cost-benefit analysis of repression. We try to increase the cost of human rights violations to make it so it's not, as profitable to these leaders, and they're forced to change. So that's what the book's about. It tells really story after story of how we were able to put pressure on governments and force them to behave better.
And indeed, you have written this book, haven't you, as a handbook for action, I think you call it, that when people understand the tactics that Human Rights Watch use to push back against these abusive governments, that you hope that they will join the fight.
That's exactly right. In other words, if you ask people, are you for human rights? They'll say, yeah, sure, I am. But they don't really know how you can move human rights forwards, how you can really strengthen the defense. And I thought that I spelled it out with really concrete examples, it would empower people. It would make them more likely to really join the cause. And, as I describe in the book, there really are 2 core things that we did to try to force governments to behave better. One is that we played on the fact that in today's world, every government pretends to respect human rights. They obviously fall short. And when we're able to, conduct the careful investigations that Human Rights Watch is known for and document and spotlight the discrepancy between the haughty pretense and the ugly reality, that's embarrassing. It's stigmatizing. It delegitimizes them. They hate it. They attack us. But, ultimately they recognize that they won't get rid of the bad press we're able to generate until they change the bad conduct. And that's when we begin to make progress. Now, the other thing we would do is, we would go to governments, frankly, like New Zealand's, where they purport to promote human rights in their foreign policy. And we say, would you help us put pressure on the target? Because every abusive government wants something. It could be, arms sales or trade benefits or an invitation to some fancy summit. If we can deprive them of these things until they behave better, that's another source of pressure.
And so did you come to New Zealand governments over your years to do that?
We dealt mainly with New Zealand in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council or in New York at the UN General Assembly. But, Human Rights Watch has had an office actually in Sydney, and so we worked with Australia probably more than New Zealand, but we worked with, frankly, any friendly government that could put pressure on the targets. And sometimes it was a matter of being part of a big coalition. One story I tell in the book where New Zealand was an important part is, how we got the International Criminal Court, because the US government hated the idea of a court that could reach Americans. And, it thought a court was for everybody else. That was not our idea of international justice. And we put together a coalition of 60 governments that, individually they may not have had that much clout, but together they had real moral authority. And we pushed it through. And when push came to shove at the big Rome conference in 1998 to create the court, the US lost 120-7. And that's the court that today is the last stop for the prosecution of people responsible for genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity.
You talk in the book about one of your key tactics, and you touched on it before, but it's shame, isn't it? The idea that even a brutal dictator like Gaddafi or someone is concerned about their reputation, and that capturing facts can lead to the release of political prisoners, say. But I guess in an era of President Xi and Putin and Trump, does that hold, or are we in a human rights recession, do you think?
Well, clearly this is a difficult time for human rights. But as I describe in the book, everybody has to pretend to respect human rights. So, I describe the campaign that Human Rights Watch really led to try to put China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council. China had detained 1 million Uyghurs, was trying to force them to abandon their religion, their language, their culture. And they were trying to cover it up. So we were able to first get Michelle Bachelet, the prior UN human rights chief, to issue a very strong report. We then went to the UN Human Rights Council. And Xi Jinping cared so much about this effort. He was so concerned about being tarnished by the UN Human Rights Council that he was personally making phone calls to heads of state. Now, we lost this effort by 2 votes. It was very close. But it shows that, even a big, powerful country like China cares about its reputation in the human rights realm.
What about the situation, though, when governments don't have shame, or indeed even see human rights violation as a cause of celebration? You see some governments that want to demonise immigrants, or they want to demonise LGBT communities. What do you do in that situation?
Yeah, no, I tell the story, for example, of Hungary and Poland in Europe, where each was being led by a far-right government. One, Viktor Orban, is still there in Hungary. And they, found it politically profitable to demonize immigrants, to demonize LGBT people. And so, if we go to Viktor Orban and say, you're persecuting immigrants, he would say, of course I am. That's my trademark. So a frontal approach didn't work. But what we found is that Hungary and Poland, for that matter, still cared about their huge subsidies that they received from the European Union. And persecuting immigrants and persecuting gays was not popular in Brussels. So we went to Brussels, and it took time. We actually mainly worked with Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor who had the presidency of the European Union at the time. And we were able to condition these huge subsidies on an end what was called to, violations of the rule of law. That's the way they put it. And this contributed to actually the loss of the far-right party's power in Poland. Orban is still there, but he's been constrained. He's had to make various compromises. So it shows that, even if a frontal attack may not work, there often are ways around the side that governments still care about, they still have to listen to, and that's how you can move them. But, what I try to do with the book is to show these are the kind of creative strategies that you can work out. There's always an angle. There's always something you can do to force the government to behave better.
If we step back a little bit, human rights is a relatively recent idea, isn't it? The Declaration on Human Rights is, I think, 1948, in the context being the world looking on in horror post-World War II and the Holocaust. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon, really, isn't it?
The formal recognition of human rights, yes. The ideas behind it are pretty basic. They're pretty human. I've traveled the world for my job. I've never met somebody who wants to be summarily executed. I've never met somebody who wants to be tortured or, deprived of a fair trial or persecuted for their religion or deprived of housing or healthcare or food or what have you. So, these are human needs, human desires. And so, yes, beginning in 1948, they were codified in the Declaration and then in various treaties. But this reflects I think, a basic aspect of humanity. It's what we all want.
In your book, you detail how you put facts and the gathering of facts and accuracy and made that a total and top priority. But of course, facts have to be visible then, don't they? And it's interesting to track the trajectory of Human Rights Watch and its power and that of mass communications technology. How closely do you think those two things are linked?
Well, I mean, as I describe in the book, I actually think that you can trace the trajectory of the human rights movement by the evolution of communications technology. And so, back in the olden days when information traveled by sailing ship, you could only address big, long-lasting things like, the slave trade or women's suffrage, because you just didn't learn about anything else. But, the human rights movement really came to the fore with modern communications. Initially it was just, being able to mail letters or make phone calls, but, over time it was email, social media. And so today, we're in a position to learn about really anything that happens in the world. The idea that a government can hide its abuses is pretty difficult to do. And we can disseminate that information, today with the aim of stopping human rights abuses tomorrow. And so the human rights movement is much more powerful today because of the ready access to information. Now, obviously, the bad guys can use information, technology too, and they can disseminate disinformation or propaganda. They can use, bots and artificial intelligence to try to fight back. But I still, people sometimes ask me, are we in a post-truth environment? And I say no, because there are, people, many people, not everybody, many people still want to find the truth. They look to reputable sources. And I think the best evidence of the power of the truth are people like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, because they preside over, massive disinformation machinery, but they still use censorship. They don't trust the disinformation alone. They still try to prevent their people from gaining access to the truth. And that just, illustrates that they care about the truth because truth is how they are held accountable. In a genuine post-truth world, they can do whatever they want. They can just deny. But in a world where truth matters, they are held accountable to their people. That's what we try to do. That's what they try to resist.
Yes, and you'll see Putin say that he isn't running a war, he's running a special military operation to denazify Ukraine. Sure, and you'll see massive censorship and surveillance in China. But where does the president of your own country, Donald Trump, fit into that? Because he can turn around on CNN and say, oh, well, actually, it was Ukraine that started the war. Or he can say, well, actually, you're just fake news. And the media is the enemy of the state. Why do you think Donald Trump sees it as so important to discredit journalism?
Well, I mean, he's trying to discredit journalism because, if whatever he said, the latest blather, is considered the truth, then he can get away with anything, But in fact, the media in the United States and around the world is strong. It keeps pushing back. It keeps highlighting the lies. And so, while his spin may work for say the 30% of his base, it doesn't work for the American public as a whole. He actually is quite unpopular. He's got the lowest popularity ratings of a president at this stage, I think, in recent history. And he is sensitive to that. So, I think Trump is shameable. Now, you can't go to Trump frontally and say, you're violating human rights, because he'll probably say, what are those? But you can play to his ego, to his desire to maintain a positive reputation. And in his case, what he really cares about, he thinks of himself as a master deal maker. The art of the deal, that was his book. And so that gives us an opening because, if he wants a Nobel Peace Prize for coming up with, an Israeli-Palestinian peace, he's not going to get it by, forcibly expelling 2 million Palestinians from Gaza. That's a massive war crime. It's a crime against humanity. So, it gives us something to work with to say, okay, you want to be recognized for your deal making, you got to do it lawfully. If you look at Ukraine, does he really want to be known as the guy who was bamboozled by Putin, who handed Ukraine's democracy to the Kremlin? I don't think so. He'll be the Neville Chamberlain of the 21st century. That's not the legacy he wants. So this gives us something to work with. And, it's not easy working with Donald Trump. I mean, this is a guy who is pretty indifferent to every norm under the sun. But he does care about one thing always, and that's himself. And so if we can show that his reputation will be tarnished by doing the latest, anti-rights thing, we can get something done.
We can draw together a few of the things that we've already talked about in response to Donald Trump, can't we? I mean, the immigration policies and the deportation, I mean, surely that must concern someone like yourself. We've seen people deported to Ecuador and ending up in some sort of supermax prison without any due process at all.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think his deportation policy is a good illustration of how it is possible to hold Trump to account, because he likes to say, oh, I'm going to get rid of millions of undocumented immigrants in the United States. And the part of his policy that is popular with the American people is securing the US-Mexican border. There was a broad sense that people were just coming across that border willy-nilly, and the US government had to secure it. So that part is popular. But it turns out that what's not popular is these immigration raids, where he just goes into, communities that are perceived to have undocumented immigrants, or workplaces where they might be, and just picks people up, because the people he's picking up are integrated members of the community. They may not have legal papers, but they often have jobs, pay taxes, have families with US citizen wives or, spouses or kids. And it is quite unpopular to deport these people. It also turned out to be very unpopular to send people abroad without any due process. And so the courts have been ruling against him on that. And the Venezuelan man who was sent to the El Salvador, mega prison, they had to bring him back because the courts ordered them to. The various people who are, threatened with deportation because they protested against Israel, the courts have said you can't do that. So he actually is being reined in partly by the courts, partly by public opinion. And I think a case can be made that he's so overreached that he has actually kind of gotten to the limit of his momentum. The momentum is turned, and he's now, no longer paralyzing the opposition just through the sheer volume of crazy actions he was engaged in. But he's facing very significant organized pushback that has really slowed him down.
So the checks and balances are holding.
I mean, they are working. They are, it's a battle. I'm not going to pretend it's easy. He can still get a lot of stuff done that will be very harmful. He still may bomb Iran for all we know. But there are significant constraints on him. And while he is, in a sense, following the classic autocrat's handbook of trying to undercut the checks and balances on executive authority, American democracy is strong. Those checks and balances are quite viable. And so, the part that has failed is the Congress, because the slim majority that the Republicans hold in both houses of Congress are basically just going along with Trump. But the courts have held. I mean, even the US Supreme Court, which had a presumptive 6-3 majority pro-Trump, has turned into a 5-4 majority against him on some of these cases where he really is just ripping up the rule of law. So the media is still strong. The universities, despite the attacks, are still strong. Civil society is still strong. There is significant pushback. Trump just this last weekend held his big military parade on his birthday in Washington. Hardly anybody showed up. It was a complete embarrassment, but millions of people showed up across the country at 200 sites across the country at the No Kings protest, the protest against Trump's autocratic moves. So it shows that people believe in democracy, and Americans don't want to just give up to a king. And, that may be what he wants, but it's not so easy to get.
Let's talk about Israel. You say in your book that no aspect of our work was more closely scrutinised than our reporting on Israel, and no other country was mentioned as often by critics as a source of concern. Why is that?
Well, I mean, the Israeli government has, a pretty organized constituency that just defends everything it does, regardless of what it does. And so there are these little groups that would attack us, regardless of what we said, if it was critical of Israel. And I just got used to this. That's just life. But we had to make sure that, our reporting on Israel was scrupulously accurate, as we try to do every place in the world, and that it was principled, that we were applying the same principles to Israel as we did to everybody else. And if we pass that test, and I personally would scrutinize our work on Israel and Palestine, if we pass that test, we put it out, of course we'd be criticized. we lived with it. And we developed, I think, a real reputation for probity, for accuracy, for being principled. And that gave our criticism out. It gave it power. That's why they hated us. That's why they came after us. But when, for example, Human Rights Watch issued a report on the fact that what Israel was doing to the Palestinians in the occupied territory was apartheid, that became the common understanding. And today, every human rights group that has looked at the issue seriously has found apartheid.
That's right.
And so
yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because this was the 2021 report that you did on
yes,
that. Then Amnesty followed, didn't they? I think a year later.
yes,
And now
about
that
6 months later. Yes,
yeah, okay.
yes.
And that is now considered inappropriate definition because you weren't comparing it with South Africa. You were meeting the definition, right?
That's exactly right. We in fact said right up front, this is not an historical analogy. This is a legal analysis. We're applying the definition of apartheid in the UN Convention Against Apartheid and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And we then had, a 200 plus page report filled with facts showing why what Israel was doing in the occupied territory was apartheid. And, when we put the report out, the Israeli government didn't know what to do with it. I mean, its defenders, use the usual name calling, said we're biased, anti-Semitic, whatever, but they didn't have any factual response because the facts were correct. And that's how we knew it, we were making progress. And indeed, that's why I think, many governments now, and it's become almost common wisdom that, what's happening, at least in the West Bank, is apartheid. I mean, today what's happening in Gaza is, in a sense, surpassed apartheid because it's massive war crimes, it's genocide. But still in the West Bank, it's apartheid. And this has ongoing relevance because if you ask, what's the ultimate solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I mean, the crazies in the Netanyahu government, want to just get rid of the Palestinians, solve the problem that way. But, that would be a huge crime against humanity. And Egypt, Jordan, they're not going to go along with that. So the, next alternative that Netanyahu prefers is the status quo. And the effect of the Human Rights Watch report and our colleagues' reports was to say, that's not acceptable. That's apartheid. And the only acceptable solution is a two-state solution. As an Israeli state and a Palestinian state living in peace side by side. That's the solution. Netanyahu has devoted his career to avoiding that, but it's the only appropriate, fair solution to the conflict.
We'll come to the blowback that you received over that report, meeting that definition of apartheid. But just firstly, because you did mention it, but I want to get it firmly on the record. So you're saying, and we'll mention Hamas as well, but you're saying that Israel's actions in Gaza, they are acts of genocide, they are war crimes.
Well, I mean, the war crimes is pretty straightforward. In other words, it's a war crime to starve the civilian population, which on and off the Netanyahu government has been doing. It's a war crime to indiscriminately bomb a populated area, which they were doing with, say, the 2,000-pound bombs. It's even a war crime to, attack a single Hamas fighter knowing that there'd be 20 civilians who were killed. That's a disproportionate attack. I mean, there are many, many examples like this of people who are shot because they enter a zone without any warning. Even the killing these days of, people who are desperately trying to get food and they show up at a distribution center and are shot. So there are plenty of war crimes. The genocide point, I think, that tends to be more contested. And genocide requires two elements. On the one hand, an act, on the other hand, intent. The acts can be large-scale killing, and certainly let's call it 35,000 civilians killed, far exceeds, the 8,000 killed at Srebrenica, which was already found to be genocide. The other route to genocide is creating conditions that are unsuitable to life, and that's what the entire starvation and deprivation strategy is about. So the real issue comes down to intent. And, was their intent to destroy in whole or in part the Palestinian population? And there are some, statements by senior officials that are clearly indicative of that. The former defense minister Gallant saying these are all human animals. The president saying there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. So these are indicative of genocidal intent, but much of the intent will be drawn from the conduct. And the International Court of Justice has odd jurisprudence there. They kind of say, if there's another understanding, maybe that's not genocidal intent. But that would sort of suggest that because the intent here is not, I should say, to kill every single Palestinian, is to kill enough to create conditions that are bad enough that the rest just flee. It's very similar to what Myanmar did with the Rohingya. kill about 30,000 to send 730,000 fleeing to Bangladesh. And in fact, that's a case that's before the International Court of Justice. Now, that'll be decided before the Gaza case. But I suspect that that will be found to be genocide, and what Israel is doing in Gaza will be found to be genocide too. That genocide is not just the final solution. It's not just kill everybody you can. It also can be a means to an end. It can be kill enough to try to force everybody else out. And that, I think, is what Israel is doing in Gaza.
And just to get on the record too, obviously you would see Hamas action on October 7. That's a war crime too, right?
Absolutely. There's no question. It is a blatant war crime to deliberately kill civilians. It's a war crime to abduct civilians. And a basic rule is war crimes by one side do not justify war crimes by the other.
Okay.
That's true both ways.
Okay. This report we mentioned where you said that Israel's actions in the West Bank had met the definition of apartheid. That blew back on you, didn't it? Because after your career at Human Rights Watch, you had some sort of fellowship offer at Harvard. They got nervous about this. And it's this potential sort of weaponization of the claim of anti-Semitism, isn't it, to some degree? And they cancelled you. I think they reversed course in the end. But that must have been especially galling, given your family had fled Nazi Germany, and then here you are being accused of anti-Semitism.
Well, I should say, Harvard didn't accuse me of anti-Semitism, but I am accused of anti-Semitism, which I should say is a real cheapening of an important concept, because Jews in today's world are facing heightened anti-Semitism. There's no question about that. But if people see charges of anti-Semitism as just being an excuse to suppress legitimate criticism of Israel, that cheapens the concept at a point where it's needed. It basically prioritizes the defense of the Israeli government over the defense of Jews around the world. So it's a horrible misuse of an important concept. Now, what happened at Harvard, I was, tentatively offered this fellowship pending the dean's approval. I then spoke with him, and he ended up rejecting it because of my criticism of Israel. Now, this caused such an uproar. There were like 2 intense weeks of protests at Harvard and media around the world. And at the end of the 2 weeks, the dean called an emergency faculty meeting. Nobody supported him. They all said I should have been given the fellowship. So to his credit, he reversed course. And I went on to be a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. But he denied that he had spoken to any donors. He said he'd spoken to people who mattered to him, whatever that means, probably the development department, the fundraising people. But it was, I think, just a real miscalculation on his part, because I think he thought I would just sort of, go away quietly. And I thought, no, I'm not going to just, put up with this. How can a major public policy school with a human rights center not tolerate criticism of Israel? That just seemed absurd.
How much of a motivation has that family backstory been to you? You graduated, I think, from Yale Law School in 1980.
Yes.
A lot of your classmates and then colleagues must have gone on to make huge money with private firms. I think you went on to be an attorney for the DOJ, did you? And you worked on Iran-Contra and other fascinating things. But then you joined what is really a pretty cottage industry, we would say, or a niche industry at the time, right? So your colleagues and friends must have thought you were sort of out on the fringe a little bit at that point.
They thought I was out of my mind. But Guy, your question is, clearly a very formative fact for me was my father's experience. He grew up in Frankfurt, Germany, a young Jewish boy under the Nazis, and was there for 5 years under Hitler until his father could finally, my grandfather, could get the family out. They were fortunate to get out to New York. But I grew up with Hitler stories. I grew up with what it was like to be a young boy, worried about being beaten up by the brown shirts in the playground, worried that the police would arrest my grandfather for some pretext. And I became, very aware of the evil that governments could do. And that's a big part of what pushed me to try to devote my career to preventing a recurrence of atrocities of that sort by anybody.
Mm. Let's just finish, a couple of minutes to go, but we started with this idea too. This idea that small groups and individuals can change the world. You look at Thomas Clarkson, the British abolitionist who led the campaign, I think in the 1700s, early 1800s, to abolish the slave trade in the British Empire. You've got Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat at the back of the bus and went on to be the sort of mother of the civil rights unit, the civil rights activism. So what advice would you have, Ken, to younger people who want to change the world?
Well, it seems daunting. The world's a big place. People tend to say, well, what can I do? And I think what it's important to recognize is that, the capacity to shame governments that I described earlier depends on the public sense of right and wrong. So if, Guyan, if I say, this government over here, they were, doing X, and people say, that doesn't look so bad, we won't shame them. We're only able to shame them if people think that it's wrong. And that requires, a well-developed sense of right and wrong. Now, how do we get that basic sense? In some sense, you get it at school. In some sense, you get it from your parents, from religion. But a lot of it is really just, from friends, from family members, from our acquaintances. It's not from distant institutions. It's from the people we know. And so when people ask me, what can I do? I say, talk about these issues, because you are a very influential person in your realm, among your friends, among your acquaintances. And as you talk about these issues, you help reinforce that sense of right and wrong, which is critical for the defense of human rights.
Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it, Kenneth Roth.
Thank you. My pleasure.
That was 30 Minutes with Kenneth Roth. This is 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We'll catch you next time.